because I want to do again another mailbag episode as a way to try to address some of the common questions or good questions that have come my way in the last couple of weeks and months. So the first question comes from Mike, and the question was, are all contracts automatically assignable unless there is language in the contract that prevents it? And yes. The answer in both Minnesota and Wisconsin is that the presumption is that any contract is assignable unless there's something in the contract that specifically says it isn't. An assignable contract, what that means is, let's just say a buyer wants to assign their right to buy to somebody else. Real estate wholesalers, for example, some of that stuff involves getting a property under contract, remarketing it, and then selling that to someone else, maybe taking a little bit of a compensation from that assignment. Other things can happen as well. A seller could end up assigning their sale to someone as well. That's less common. And if you're interested in that type of wholesaling thing, you're probably going to want to talk to me because there's much more to go into than what I'm talking about right here. But at its core, the idea is any contract can be assigned via a written instrument, an assignment contract, to anybody else, except when the contract says that it can't. So some contracts will say this contract cannot be assigned. But the standard Minnesota purchase agreement, the standard Wisconsin offer to purchase contracts do not have such a limitation in them. Now, I know it's not uncommon in certain situations for an agent when they're filling out a purchase agreement to write, the name of the buyer and then write in or assigns, which is perfectly fine. It's maybe a little bit unnecessary, but it's perfectly fine to do. And in fact, if you know that the buyer plans to assign it, perhaps they're going to take title not in their own name as the buyer, but for an LLC or something like that. Perfectly acceptable, perfectly appropriate to just add that little or assigns language after the name of the buyer to just round out the situation and make sure that there's no confusion later. But even if you forget to do that or choose not to do that for some reason, the buyer can still, or that side of the contract can still assign their rights to anyone else if they so choose. All right, next question. Ed, is there a limit to the dollar amounts of what we can legally give as a closing gift, such as a gift card? The answer is no. There is no limit at all. If you want to be generous with a closing gift or whatever you're so interested in, there's really no limitation except your own discretion on what you might choose to do to be generous. Now, there is a limit on how much you can deduct on your taxes as a business person if you want to write off that gift, and that limit is typically $25 in the federal tax code. So, if you're going to try to maximize the benefit of a gift or something on your taxes, you're going to only be able to maximum $25 per client per gift. But if you want to be more generous than that, if you are doing this out of the graciousness of your heart or as an astute business person, as opposed to being strictly sticking to the numbers and only giving what you can write off. If it's a real gift, you are really not limited by anything. So you can certainly give a gift to a client as an organic and true and genuine thank you in any amount or in any form that you want. There are things like RESPA and things of that nature that we want to be mindful of, where we're not giving something of value in exchange for a referral, but that's different than a gift, right? A gift is something that is true and genuine and is given after the fact. There's been no promise. There's no quid pro quo. It is simply, thank you for choosing me to be your trusted real estate partner. I value you as a client, and I want to give you this gift as a demonstration of my gratitude. You're more than able to do that in any way or in any form or in any amount that you choose. Question number 3. Ed, I represent a buyer, and I asked the listing agent if she or anyone else in her office has written an offer. The listing agent said, she wasn't sure what she had to tell me and went on to say she doesn't really know how to respond to my question. I thought there was a rule that said if you ask a question to the listing agent that they have to answer. Is that correct or incorrect? Yes, that is correct. That is a good question, and sounds like perhaps the agent on the other side of that transaction needs a little bit of the education here, but you all can be the person who teaches that agent. And the answer to that question, isn't the agent responsible for answering some of my questions about the other offers, comes from the Realtor Code of Ethics. And the Realtor Code of Ethics says that if asked, the listing agent must disclose certain things if asked these specific questions. And I will caveat all this by saying, if asked, they must answer these questions unless the seller, the client, has instructed the listing agent in writing not to answer these questions. And the idea that a seller would instruct an agent to not answer these questions in advance of being asked of them is probably pretty rare. So it's uncommon, but it's possible. So we sort of have to accept the reality that ultimately what the seller decides what kind of information gets released, the seller does get to choose that, whether the listing agent answer those questions or not. However, in most typical situations, that's not the case. And so if asked, if you as a buyer's agent ask a listing agent, what are the source of the other offer? Are we in multiple offers, yes or no? And they say yes. Okay, what are the sources of those other offers? The listing agent must answer the question and disclose whether any of those other offers that were being received are from her as the listing agent, meaning she has representing the seller and she's written an offer for one of her buyer clients. She has to disclose if any of those other offers are coming from her brokerage, so not from her personally, but from her brokerage, which would also make it potentially a dual agency situation between her seller as the listing agent and her broker. Someone else from her brokerage has written an offer on behalf of the buyer. Or the last catch-all would be that any of these other offers are not from her or her brokerage, which would mean it came from anybody else. So those are questions that you can ask, and especially, and the reason behind that rule is to try to account for a variable rate commission situation. If the listing agent has disclosed that there may be a variable rate commission, which would suggest that the seller might incur some type of additional net savings or proceeds because they're offering a variable rate commission, and the idea would be if it's a variable rate, if the buyer comes from, let's just say, the listing agent or listing broker, the commission might be reduced. That situation is important for an agent not affiliated with that listing agent or broker to understand that they may be competing against a deck that's slightly stacked against our favor as the buyer's agent. So understanding, hey, it's a variable rate commission situation, asking the question, are any of the offers yours? Finding out that one of them is yes, one of the listing agent's own buyers, understanding that might mean we don't really know for sure what the variable rate commission might be, but we know that the cards are stacked against us. That just gives our buyer the extra information or ammo to know I probably have to may want to consider pushing my offer even a little bit higher, just because it's the possibility that if my offer stacks up equally against that other offer, because it's a variable rate, the scales might be tipped not in my favor. So a long-winded answer to the question of, yes, there are certain questions that you're required to answer unless your seller has instructed you otherwise. And specifically, again, in a multiple offer scenario, disclosing the source of the offers, whether it's your buyer's offer, your broker's offer, or another broker's offer. Hey, Ed, we had a seller who misplaced the main house key for their home, and access is still possible via the garage entering code, but is it legally required that the seller has to give keys to their buyer if they can't find the keys? Good example of an issue that does come up in different ways from time to time, and whether it's surrounding keys or garage doors openers, we get around to the same idea where it's not so much about what the contract says, but what the buyer's expectations are. And I don't think it's unreasonable for the buyer to have an expectation that when they purchase a home, they will have access to the home and there will be a key or something to be able to use when they move in. And so it is probably a bit of a tough situation if the seller has genuinely lost all the keys. because I think there's probably a reasonable expectation that for most buyers that they would at least get one key and then they can make copies. But if they don't have any keys, they're going to have to maybe call a locksmith or replace the locking mechanism entirely. But that's maybe a separate issue. It could be addressed through a disclosure and negotiation or things like that. But what we need to remember is that in the purchase agreement itself, all that the contract says is that the seller will provide at closing any of the following, and that includes all keys in their possession and all garage door items in their possession. It doesn't in the contract say how many of them there are or how many of them there are supposed to be. Just whatever the seller has, that's what they're contractually obligated to provide to the buyer. So it's usually not so much an issue. Typically, I don't hear a lot of this where the sellers don't have any keys, but I guess it can happen. I've certainly had scenarios where the buyer or the seller doesn't have any of the garage door openers. They just don't have them. They used an app on their car and they never even had a physical garage door opener left. And it's not uncommon where we get in a situation where this buyer was expecting more keys than what they end up getting at closing. They were hoping and expecting 2 garage door openers because they have 2 vehicles, and then when they buy it, they find out there's only 1, and they're not happy about it. But it's important to understand that contractually speaking in the contract, the seller is only required to provide what they have. And so whether that's 1 key or 100, and whether that's 1 garage door opener, 2 garage doors openers, what have you, the seller under the contract is only required to give what they have. And this is probably one of those things that really only comes up at the very last minute because those things get passed across the table at a closing or handed off from agent to agent in anticipation of the closing. And sometimes it's less than what the buyers were hoping for. But at the same point, there are plenty of buyers who first thing they do when they come into a new home is change the locks anyway. And to that extent, the old keys become irrelevant anyway. But I guess it's perhaps a conversation to try to have with the other side to ask some questions about keys and garage door openers at a certain point. But I tend to think that that's probably lower on the priority list than some of the other items. But it is atypical where there were no keys at all. I can understand that one was probably a bit of a shock to the buyer, but I hope that closing happened and went off without a hitch. Hey Ed, from Tara, can you please tell me what this verbiage actually means? Bona fide arm's length transaction, or bona fide if we're gonna go Latin. That is a great question. It is one that my immediate answer is just say a real transaction. But let's be technical about it. So pulling up an actual definition, a bona fide or bona fide arm's length transaction or sale means a transaction in cash or terms equivalent to cash for a specific and specified property rights after reasonable exposure in a competitive market between a willing, well-informed, and prudent buyer and seller with adverse economic interests and assuming neither party is acting under undue compulsion or duress. Now that's the super technical term for it. The real answer, what's a bona fide, arm's length transaction? It's a real transaction. It's not a sham transaction. It's not one where, let's just say, someone's making up a buyer, right? A great example would be a contingent offer. If I have a contingent offer and the seller calls my contingency and I have to, come up with a real contract that proves that I sold my home in order to keep my contract with the seller to keep that transaction moving forward, I can't fabricate a fake buyer. And I also wouldn't necessarily want to come up with some sort of sham buyer, ask my friend to write an offer that they don't actually intend to move forward with. Those types of kind of obvious, you could say almost borderline on fabricated types of fake transactions. Those aren't bona fide, arm's length transactions. Also, back in the short sale days, back when sometimes people were trying to sell properties short or something like that, there was a requirement in the short sale approval process, that those offers be vetted as being, bona fide and arm's length. And that would mean they're coming from real people unaffiliated with the seller. So not like, hey, I'm behind on my mortgage. Will you come buy this property from me? We'll sell it short and then I'll sort of buy it back from you because we're buddies. Like that type of personal relationship would render that thing not an arm's length transaction when there's some sort of behind the scenes dealings or some sort of other secret agenda or something like that. So if it's on the market, if it's a real buyer, if it's a real seller, if they're not related, if they don't know each other, if there's actual negotiations happening back and forth, if it's just a real transaction, that's a bona fide arm's length transaction. Hey, the seller's never lived in the home, and we have a disclosure alternative with waived right to disclose, meaning they waived the seller's disclosure using the disclosure alternatives waiver. And now, after the inspection, the seller has decided that they want to sell it as is. What can we do, and how do we do it to make that happen? Now, this is a good long question to try to answer, or the good answer is going to be nice and long, but the short answer is whenever a client asks us to sell something as is, I think the immediate response we have to that question is, okay, what do you mean when you say you want to sell it as is, right? Because there's typically two main things that a seller is thinking about when they sell it as is. And the one is, I don't want to fix anything. I'm not handy, or I'm just tired of this house. And so if you're going to do an inspection, fine, but don't ask me to fix anything, right? Well, we don't need a form for that. We don't need to say it's as is for that. If the buyer does an inspection and asks for some inspection requests, the seller can just say no. They don't have to. In Minnesota, they just say no, and the buyer can then choose if they want to potentially walk away or try to negotiate a different solution. Maybe they don't ask for repairs. Maybe they just ask for a price concession or something like that. In Wisconsin, the seller has the option and the opportunity to cure certain defects if they want to, but they don't have to elect to do those things. So at the end of the day, if it's just the fact that the seller doesn't want to, deal with a potential repair, if they just want the buyer to take the property, fine, then just say no thank you to any potential inspection repair requests. But that's maybe only half the story. The other half, the other potential reason why they're wanting to sell it as is because they not only don't want to make any repairs now, they don't want to have to deal with the hassle of this sale or anything else after closing either, which is another way of saying they don't want to be liable for any post-closing issues either. And that is not so easily accomplished. That is not, saying the words as and is and putting that in a contract is not a magic wand that waves away any clients or sellers' legal liabilities. There are statutes that apply to a sale of a property. There are, legal obligations, whether that is to make, do a proper seller's disclosure, to make, truthful representations and things like that in their marketing for sale. There's title issues involved. I mean, if I sold a property but actually deeded it to my friend the day before closing, but then say, haha, as is, I'm not going to get away with that, right? I mean, it's a lot more complicated and nuanced than that. Certainly not the idea of just saying the words as and is doesn't make anyone's problems disappear. But if in this case, remember, they have already done the disclosure alternatives waiver option, and that will likely limit the seller's legal obligations post-closing down to just about nothing. The disclosure alternatives waiver means the seller doesn't have to disclose any material facts. That agreement between the buyer and seller waiving the seller's disclosure obligations is going to limit the seller's post-closing liability substantially. And it is only in that scenario with the disclosure alternatives waiver that it would be appropriate to then add into the contract the as-is addendum, which is a document that was created by the Association of Realtors in Minnesota. And the as-is addendum basically restates what the waiver already states, which is the buyer understands that they're buying it as is with all faults, and they understand that they're not relying upon the seller's disclosures because there are none because they did a waiver, and they accept the property in its condition, and they're essentially going to move forward. So to that extent, again, a long way to try to answer that kind of tough question, but it's not an uncommon one. people always want to sell it as is, and unfortunately we have to try to do a good job explaining to them, well, it's just not that simple, but there are solutions to your concerns. We just have to walk through what those concerns are and then address them one at a time. Ooh, this one I have received several different calls, emails about in the last several weeks, and it has to do with the sale of a home that's in an HOA, and specifically a home that has a common interest community disclosure obligation, meaning that the seller has to provide, or the HOA has to provide, documentation from the common interest community, the HOA, along with the resale disclosure certificate. And it comes up from time to time that the buyer is more than willing, and the seller is actually also interested in seeing the 10-day right of rescission, the right for a buyer to cancel within a 10-day time period after receiving all those condo docs. But they want to shorten that down. They want to shorten that period down to a shorter amount. And that is possible to do only under certain specific circumstances in Minnesota. The 10-day right of rescission law that was created by the Minnesota Common Interest Ownership Act, that says, as a default, once the buyer has received the documents, the condo docs, they have 10 days to review them, and within that time frame, they can elect to cancel and rescind the contract at any point within 10 days. But a buyer who has received those documents may agree with the seller to shorten that time frame down in certain circumstances. And the specific limitation that's created by a Minnesota statute that certain agents seem to forget about from time to time is that you cannot shorten the 10-day right of rescission in the terms of the actual purchase agreement itself. And the only way that you can shorten it is, first of all, is in an addendum, which there is a document called a common interest community modification/waiver form, CIC modification/waiver form. You can use that document to shorten the time frame down, but only, and this is the most important part, you can only shorten the time frame down from 10 days to something less after 3 days have elapsed since the day that you received the resale disclosure certificate. Now, typically the resale disclosure certificate gets ordered around the time that the purchase agreement is finalized. So typically that means you finalize the purchase agreement, give them the seller order the condo docs, give them the condo docs, and then after you've received those condo docs and specifically the resale disclosure certificate, once 3 days have elapsed, then the parties could agree to shorten the CIC addendum period. Now, how that all plays out and why people would ultimately want to think about doing this is, let's just say in the time frame of a transaction, the parties put a contract together. So final acceptance date was today. Let's say there's a 7-day inspection contingency window. So we get started on this inspection right away, and we're working through that process. Also, we order the condo docs, and listing agent now provides the condo docs to the buyer, including the resale disclosure certificate. Now, as we go through the inspection contingency, and let's just say 3 days have now elapsed from the receipt of the condo docs, and we're finalizing the terms of the inspection-related issues, and the parties want to say, okay, we're about here, we want to button all this up, but we want this to be done. Not only do we want the inspection to be done, but we also don't want you to come back and also have some concerns or try to renegotiate based upon things that you see in the condo docs as well. So we want to wrap this all up in a nice, clean tiny bow or whatever, and be done with both the inspection contingency and the CIC addendum period, CIC rescission period at the same time. You can do that and do both at the same time, resolve the inspection contingency with an amendment and also use the CIC modification form, addendum form. You can do those two things together, but only if, again, 3 days have elapsed since the buyer received the resale disclosure certificate document, and presumably all the other forms as well. That one does trip people up from time to time, and that one we really want to be diligent about making sure that we have we're following that portion of that law and making sure that our documents comply with Minnesota statute. So feel free to reach out to me when you have questions in those scenarios. Last question, great question. Hey, from an agent, running into more and more of these brokers who are offering less than what is customary, between in our markets regarding the buyer side payouts. Essentially saying, whatever's customary in that market, the listing agent is offering less than that amount. And how do we address it? How do we try to ensure that we're getting paid what we agreed to with our clients in the buyer rep agreement document, because our buyers don't necessarily want to pay us out directly for that shortfall. And there's a form that we've created that's exclusive for you with RE/MAX Results in the Instanet, the Commission Modification Agreement Form. Commission Modification Agreement Form is for use when you find yourself in these scenarios where the buyer is aware that there's a lower than what is typical or market, or lower what is in your buyer rep agreement payout, which would mean they would be responsible for paying you some or all of that shortfall, because you're worth it and because that's what our contract says. They would prefer that be paid out through the listing side from the seller. So you can present this commission modification agreement form to the listing agent, negotiate out, and try to reach a resolution. Not to say that you will always be able to reach a resolution. We don't know sometimes what's even available to be shared on the other side. But you can at least attempt at that, and if it's successful, you can use that form, the commission modification agreement form, to document and establish or renegotiate what was offered in the MLS. Well, I think that's plenty from me. Thank you, everyone, for listening. If some of those questions sound familiar, those questions came from you all. They came from you, and I shamelessly stole them to use to create this podcast. If you have questions for me, you can always send them my way. Your anonymity with Ed is always guaranteed, but the questions that I get from you all are always an indication of what's going on in the market, and certainly something that creates opportunities for us all to learn and grow and get better from. So you can always email me, ed.kaiser@results.net, or, shoot me a line at Ed Talks Real Estate on social media, whatever and however you want, carrier pigeon, anything. Feel free to send my questions my way, and I look forward to chatting again with you on the next podcast.